Hi, on May 7th, people from around the globe will come together to commemorate the 15 million children worldwide who have lost one or both parents to AIDS. If that number isn't shocking enough, experts believe there are millions more who remain unaccounted for. And by 2010, that number is expected to reach a staggering 20 million. Hi, I'm Benita Zahn, and for the next hour, I'll be moderating a very timely and informative roundtable discussion focusing on World AIDS Orphans Day, what can and what is being done to stem those incredible numbers I just mentioned. The goals of today's roundtable include informing the local community on how HIV/AIDS is affecting children throughout the world, showcase what members of local communities are doing to address this global issue, and the lessons they've learned along the way. And finally, discuss what's being done to help these children in a world with limited resources. In the studio today, we not only have an expert panel, but an audience who is passionate about this subject, and if time permits, we'll be taking some questions from these folks. So let's get right to it. Joining me are former governor of Rotary International District 7190, Ann Cargile. Also, Teresa Dangwa, founder and CEO of Dangwa Initiative, which I'd like to just point out that Teresa says she's the proud single mother of 250 children as the founder and CEO of Dangwa Initiative. It's a faith-based mission. This initiative is to empower and restore dignity to AIDS orphan girls and women in resource-limited settings who've been made vulnerable by HIV/AIDS through provision of tangible and culturally sensitive resources. Teresa, thank you so much for efforting this program today. Also with us, Ivy Gamble-Cobb. Ivy is the executive director of the Family Center in New York City. Also joining us, Susanna Granis. Susanna is founder and executive director of CHABA, that is Children Affected by HIV/AIDS. Dr. Shirley Jones joins us too. She's a distinguished professor emeritus at UAlbany School of Social Welfare, as well as founder and faculty member of the U.S.-Africa Partnership for Building Stronger Communities project. And rounding out the panel is renowned international photographer and founder of Jaja's Kids, Diane Reiner. Thank you so much, all of you, for joining us for this topic today. Let's just sort of start with an overview about what are some of the challenges that these children are facing. And Teresa, do you want to start?
One of the things that I think is mostly affecting the children is the fact that they are being left behind in education, in access to health, and in most cases, child abuse. They are very open to child abuse being now open, the fact that they don't have any covering with parents and stuff. So it ends up putting them at the risk of people who look into one of the programs that I work with. Is most of my children are affected in such a way that the girls particularly are at risk of being violated by men who believe in the myth that if as a man who is HIV positive, if they have sex with a virgin, they get cured.
There's so much education that you have to do in the community to disprove to them. I mean, we know that's not true, but to bring that message across. Anybody else want to talk about the challenges facing these children?
I can. Firsthand, I was in Zimbabwe, Africa, and I saw a young woman die of AIDS with 2 small children. And if it wasn't for the villages taking over the care of the kids, they would have been out on the streets. And we did see the AIDS orphans on the streets, and they've been abused, and it's not a good sign.
The reports say that only 15% of the children who've been orphaned by AIDS are receiving some kind of external help.
Only 15%.
That's right.
We're talking millions of children left to their own
That's right.
devices, their means, whatever wits they can assemble around them.
And in countries like South Africa, we're seeing children raising children. And this is a big problem.
And in Uganda, where I spent some time, there are 30 million people, and of that, there are 2 million orphans. So it's a huge percentage, and 20% of all children in Uganda are orphans.
And that's true of many countries.
It's not only AIDS, but it's also in Uganda there's been 20 years of wars in the north and the poverty that's already there. So there's a lot of complicated factors in children being orphans. But I think one of the main things that I've experienced is that these kids who are then left to their own devices are really emotionally vulnerable. They're extremely, they lack a sense of identity.
Let's then talk about the challenges that poses to the communities in which they are left behind.
Well, one of the things that the children have, that the pandemic has brought into the communities is that grandmothers are being forced into becoming mothers once again, because their children have died and they have left grandmothers. I mean, I have families, some of the families that I help are grandmothers who are looking after 10, 15 grandchildren with no income, with no way of even going to find a job. So for the most part, all they can really do is try to just feed the kids, and that's basic, or even just house them. That's basically all these grandparents can do at some point.
And you see that here in the United States. We work with a population of grandparents that are themselves very elderly, and their own health is compromised, and now they're finding themselves in the position of having to parent their children. And for many of them, there's their own anxiety around, what did I do in the parenting of my child that led to them becoming infected, and being very concerned about passing that on to their grandchildren. And so there's this generational issue that's happening between the grandparent and the child, and the grandchild, especially if the grandparent may have come from another country here to the United States. And so that's definitely a challenge, and the resources that may or may not be available for that grandparent to be able to take care of those children.
And I'm glad you bring up the word resources, because the grandparent may have been living with limited means and accessing community support in some fashion, perhaps a community health network, you know, the sliding fee scales, and now you're going to enter a child into this.
And very often, many of those grandparents don't even know where to begin to look for the resources. And so there's a lot of work with walking them through that process. And again, that grandparent may have been living alone, and all of a sudden, in a day, here are 3 children that show up at my door. So you now have gone from a household of 1 to a household of 4 or 5, but the housing situation hasn't changed, the financial situation hasn't changed, children may have to move from school to school, and it's definitely a challenge.
You know, you're talking about what's happening in New York City. Diane, you mentioned you spent a lot of time in Uganda. And you worked with street children in Uganda. Would you share some of the circumstances that caused these kids to end up on the streets?
Well, very often one or both parents would have died of AIDS, and so as Adi is saying, they may end up being taken in by a grandparent, or they may end up with some distant relative, or they may, kind of worst case in some ways, be with a step-parent. And the step-parent may already have their own children, and so this added child is treated with much less regard, less resources, and so these kids evaluate the situation, and very often, if they're in rural areas in particular, they feel, well, if I go into the city, you know, life is going to be better in the city, and they get into the cities and just find it's extremely difficult. So they gang together. Gang is not the best word, but they group together and they look out for each other.